Welcome to the Archangel's Feast podcast. For this conversation, I sat down with John, a friend of mine who is truly a gentleman and a scholar and a teddy bear. We talked about dialogue, kind of in an abstract way, but also examples of dialogue. Kind of the first half of the podcast is dialogue that goes catastrophically wrong, kind of worst case scenarios. And also we kind of reflected on the fact that being intelligent really doesn't make you a better communicator. There's other things going on there when two people bring different narratives to the table and have a collision. And kind of the second half was more how do people who have different paradigms and collide, how do we actually navigate that? And kind of throughout, we filled it with examples of conversations, and also we kind of talk about our faith throughout, and kind of woven into the podcast is that dynamic of how we bring our Catholicism into these conversations and how we think about them. I do want to say this is probably the worst allergies I've ever had. All kind of came to bear the day of the podcast. So I opened up the podcast by basically telling John I was excited to have it in the least excited voice I could muster. Also worth pointing out, about a minute in, we got a phone call from a mutual friend who was really excited, and the reason for her excitement was that John is proposing about a week after we recorded. So I recorded on a Sunday with John. He plans on proposing the following weekend. I'm recording this intro on the Wednesday in between, but knowing she's going to say yes, congrats, buddy. We're going to publish this after the fact, so there's no spoilers for her. We love you. I think that's it. I've decided to keep in the phone conversation for comedic effect. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I did. Thanks for tuning in. And we're recording.
Awesome.
I was hyped to have this conversation with you. I'm looking forward to having you, because I know the way we bounce ideas off each other is wicked fun.
It's true.
We like to get on a roll.
And we roll.
Just keep rolling
down that hill, picking up speed
like Limp Bizkit. Keep rolling. So actually, what I wanted to start us off with, I think this is going to be a conversation about dialogue. Kind of a meta conversation, how we talk about talking about things.
Right.
And there was an idea that crossed my mind once, and I don't know if you want to react to it, but there's something Catholic about good communication. And what I mean by that is, in order to be a really good communicator, you actually have to care about what's going on inside your audience's head, or the person you're talking with. You got to care about what's going on in their head.
The audience. Wow, way to betray yourself, Steven.
No, I'm thinking like if you're giving a talk.
No, I know.
You gotta, yeah.
Audience of one right here.
Yeah. Well, you're my audience right now. This is actually why I brought you here. I'm just gonna talk at you for about an hour and 12 minutes.
Fantastic.
But yeah, and I think that's kind of a Catholic concept too, whereas you're kind of caring about what's going on inside of people. There's a sort of care. I don't know if pastoral is the right word. That's a phone call. Rats.
Go for it. You can edit this out, right?
I could. It's Alexis. Or I could keep it in.
That's even better.
Hey, what's good? What's good?
So I'm only calling you because I'm while driving, but I heard a song and I think you would like it.
Okay.
Okay, so it's called Dance Monkey by Tones and I.
Send me a text with the title.
Okay.
I'm here with John.
Hi, Alexis. Just in on your conversation.
John! Oh my, hi John. Hi.
Hi.
I can't deal. I'm gonna crash. I'm so, oh my lord. I can't deal.
It's just John. It's just John.
That is not just Guy.
We might have to edit this out.
This is so funny.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay. Well,
No, John's got one coming in. No.
I should let you go.
That's great. Oh my
I
gosh.
don't know. Well, I don't know if there's a way to explain the excitement without.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Why? Is there something that you know that I don't know?
I hope that you know about
That you both don't? That you both know about?
John, I hope you know.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, we're in the final countdown here. You're definitely editing this out now.
Yeah. Or put it in after next weekend.
Roll it.
Yeah. All right.
I feel like I hear Mike.
No Mike. Well, there is a Mike, but Mike is not here.
Is it just you two?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even Claudia's gone.
Well, y'all are making some weird voices over there.
Oh,
No,
really?
I missed my accent.
I don't know what. You missed your exit?
Oh.
Sounds like Jurassic Park in there.
I'm just like looking at it because I've never driven before. I don't know what it's doing. Oh no.
What exit did you miss?
And I drank today.
How tired are you right now?
I'm very tired. And it's raining. Oh my god. I can't
It's
see at
dark.
night. I don't have my glasses, and I've never been in this part of the state before. I'm gonna die. But you know, it's okay. I had a good game, so it's good.
Yeah. What was was it a college game?
No, it was I believe it was NFL.
You believe?
Yeah. Well, they're not my teams, but no, they were NFL because it was Giants and Cardinals.
Cardinals?
It was a Giants game.
Are the Cardinals an NFL team? I think
Yes.
they are.
I don't know, man.
It's been a while since I.
That is not my sport.
And a baseball team.
That's right.
You guys, wonderful news.
You gal. What's up?
I did not miss my exit. Look at the Lord doing his work and helping a sister out.
Oh my god.
Listen, don't judge me. I am trying.
The effort is palpable.
Look, Stephen James.
I can feel it from here.
Stephen James, you know that I am not good at driving at night.
I also know that you don't like driving at night.
Yeah, I hate
More
it.
to the point.
Yeah. I don't even like driving when it's dark and rainy.
I'm trying, like, literally, I think I'm focusing so hard, my little brain nugget is gonna just die.
Brain nugget.
Just like,
Can I quote you on that? Sounds like
This
Zelda.
car just cut me off. This car literally just
cut you off from the exit, so now you missed it again?
No. I mean, I'm still on it, but he just, like, yeeted into my lane with his car.
What else is he gonna merge into your lane with?
No, he was, there was not even, there was not even a turn signal. He just yeeted himself in there like he owns the place.
Yeeted.
Yeah, I'm not much for turn signals either.
You know what?
Especially
This
when moving.
man, his license plate says feces! Why does his license plate say feces?
Like poop?
Yes!
Wow.
Did she say feces?
The license plate of the guy who cut her off says feces, yeah.
But how rude. This is why he needs Jesus. I'm sorry. If you can't even merge correctly, and if you want to just run all up in here like you own the place when you don't, and your car says feces, obviously you need Jesus.
You should dial into these podcasts more often.
Oh no, I forgot again. I'm sorry.
it's like a guest
Oh,
appearance.
this is great. Yeah. This is great.
You guys, I should
You're a new segment. Congratulations.
Our feature presentation. Exhibit A in Jurassic Park.
I can't. You're gonna make me pee. Don't make me laugh.
Don't think about the rain.
Oh my goodness, I can't. Yeah. Okay. All right. You guys go have fun. Do your talk. I'll try not to die.
That's good.
All right.
Great pastime.
All right. And I will see you guys tomorrow at church.
All right.
Yes.
Unless
go.
John cancels it last minute.
Nope, not tomorrow. I can't get away with that 2 weeks in a row.
You better not. Okay. All right, guys. I'll let you go do your thing.
All right.
All right.
Okay, bye.
Peace. Well, that was awesome.
I don't know how to follow up now.
Think hero.
Was that that's a podcast, right? We're done. We're done.
There it is.
That's how you talk to people.
Cue the elevator music.
Yeah. Exhibit A: how to have a dialogue. How to hold a conversation. Just emote.
Oh man,
that's a lot of emotion. That's
that
the ultimate cosmic power. Itty bitty living space.
I'm just imagining all this like cosmic energy just like rolling down this street. I missed my exit.
Cosmic emotion.
Oh god.
I think that's a new concept now. I think we invented. Is there a word in philosophy for inventing a concept?
No, I don't think so.
Oh man,
I'm sure there is actually. You just have to find the right philosopher.
Philosophicer.
Philosophicer.
Velociraptor. Back to Jurassic Park. No, I'm just gonna try and put Jurassic Park references in this. Oh man. Alright,
wheel us back.
Wheel us back.
What are we doing?
I'm gonna have to drag us back. I don't
Okay.
think we're in rolling shape.
You
right
could set
now.
us up again and just like splice the whole thing into a new start if you wanted to.
I don't know how I'm gonna do it. Alright, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, there was dialogue, communication, Catholic, caring about other people's head. You're my captive audience right now. Little do you know, is why I brought you here to listen to me talk.
Awesome. So, I think we can start with that.
Sure.
So, I think there are a couple goals that you can have when entering a conversation. One is
sounding like me now.
Huh?
Sounding like me now.
You know, I'm on your podcast. I got to take the model. No, I think you can come at it in a conversation. Your goal could be to influence. So, a lot of times, we'll start down this road. There's more to be said. I think this will be a little simplistic, but might as well. But I think like you go into a conversation and your primary goal is sometimes to get that other person to be informed in the way that you feel they are lacking. So I have information or I have an insight that you are, at least haven't articulated to me. So I presume that you don't have it or you don't have it the way that I have it and I want to give it to you. So there's that sort of angle. I think there's times you come into a conversation where you're genuinely curious. I think like, I tell you, when you're starting out in a new relationship, I feel like that's like very rife with that kind of stuff where you just kind of like, just want to know. You're just curious. And I think to a certain extent, that's kind of how most of us, when we think of ourselves, that's the way we think of ourselves entering a conversation. Though I think there's probably less of that that's going on than we usually think there is.
That's a great way to frame it. I think when it comes to approaching a conversation with curiosity, like when you're meeting somebody new and getting to know somebody, there's more curiosity. There's also a facade of curiosity and a facade of rationality.
Sure.
That people present when in reality, I think a lot of people not listen, but what's the right word? Respond. Like people listen to respond. They don't listen to osmose.
Yeah. No, I think I think that's actually something that we get fairly often. Like, sometimes it becomes the tough part is when it becomes painfully obvious that that's what's going on. But I think there's like micro moments of that in every conversation where, and I think some of it's just being human. I mean, like, I'm trying to understand how to respond well to what you're saying now. So like I have to be in some way being proactive in the interior.
Yeah.
And have sort of like a plan for what's going to come out of my mouth after you stop speaking. So I mean, there's some of that. I think you can look at this too polarized, right? Where it's like, this is good, this is bad. But a conversation requires both these elements to be going on at the same time. So it's a question of how that balance comes. I think even I don't really like the word balance, so let me rephrase that. I think it's actually more like what is prioritized in a conversation.
And are the priorities of the two people aligned?
Yeah, that's actually a really good way of phrasing it.
I think when I was saying my bit, what was going through the back of my head is the worst conversations I've ever seen between people is someone just totally is inside themselves.
Yeah.
And they're not thinking about the other person. They're thinking about, how do I feel? And my feelings are just valid. And I'm going to tell a story where I'm the victim and how these feelings, are your fault.
Yeah.
These bad feelings that I'm feeling are someone else's fault. And, people who are smart do this. Like, I've seen smart people do this and ruin relationships.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's one of those things where it's like being smart doesn't mean you're a better communicator.
Not at all. I mean, actually, if you look at academia, a lot of times, so you're an engineer. So I mean,
that's what I tell my boss.
I'm from the liberal arts background. So I mean, I have a theology degree. And I did that without a philosophy degree, which is like, if you ask anyone in the field, they'll tell you that's an absolute no-no. So in any case, a little bit of an aside. Philosophy is very interesting because a lot of times I think, so philosophy well done, and I think you have a lot of philosopher in you, actually. In the way that you even approach these podcasts, you are searching for kind of a unity of thought, and you're pulling from different paradigms to arrive at new insights, which is beautiful. I think that's like one of the things that makes this really worthwhile.
Thanks. I actually got that from my physics degree, and I could elaborate more on that. But
that would be something to talk about on its own, I think. Because I actually, as I've been listening to some of these podcasts as they've been coming out, that's the thing I've noticed. I'm like, Stephen's a philosopher, he just doesn't know it. But maybe he does. So, in any case,
I think I just learned physics, which is an instance of natural philosophy, and
yeah, wow.
And I just did it, and then now I'm reflecting on what I was doing for 4 years.
That's a loaded topic. I'm not going to go down that with you right now, but we'll come back to it. But yeah, no, I think so. Let's back up. Where were we? Before I launched into singing your praises about
Jurassic Park.
Yeah. I think when it comes to, we're talking about communication, we're talking about the different ways people, and we were talking about academia. And I was talking about being a liberal arts major. So in philosophy, a lot of times you can just have people arguing at the most basic level of semantics, and they just will not back down from the way that a word ought to be used, right? It becomes absurd because no one's actually communicating, they're just shouting at one another. But I think there's no place that's more evident you see this than in politics, right? This is the nature of like no communication. Someone gets up, says the formal pitch to their base, and the other side reacts to it and tries to change the entire narrative to talk to their base, and there is no dialogue. I don't know if that I don't know how symptomatic that is of the entire two-party system, or if that's something more recent. But we definitely see it today.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so a couple things to kind of unpack what you were saying there is there's words, and then there's combinations of words which reveal patterns of they reveal principles or patterns, or we see this all the time in physics. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
To kind of put these two together. Where you have a description of if you're building a fence, just anything, a fence, and you're looking at the load on each beam or whatever, and where to put the nails and screws. If you're doing a wood fence, I don't know.
I mean, it works for different materials. Like that.
Point being, you have a vocabulary to describe your situation.
Sure.
And if you're trying to communicate these ideas to somebody, you agree on a vocabulary to describe the situation.
Right. There's a commonality.
But then what you do is, in order to understand the rationale behind, hey, here I want to put multiple screws here. I can't just do one, right? And if you want to provide a rationale, you're actually explaining that in terms of principles. So you use the vocabulary that you've agreed to with somebody, and then you string some words together to try and identify the patterns underneath. For example, Newton's laws of motion, or you're going to worry about how much load the beam can take.
Sure.
Or is it?
So you're extrapolating from you're taking the principle. You're using the principle as a sort of a line of argumentation or something that. So we agree on the vocabulary. Now let's agree on the principle, and then from there we launch into sort of a greater agreement. Is that kind of what you're saying, or is it greater than that?
Well, I think principles are general statements which apply universally. Well, as universally as we can make them. And so what you do is you apply these universal principles to your situation. So you agree on a vocabulary to describe your fence, and then what you do is you try and squeeze your vocabulary.
Exposit that for a minute. So what is the vocabulary that you agree on when building a fence? Just so I'm understanding you clearly.
Yeah, so you have a force on a beam. Or let's say forces on the beam. So you're going to agree on forces. You're going to agree on the acceleration of gravity. You're going to agree on the weight and the geometry of every part.
Cool.
And that's your basic description of the system.
So you're saying, like, if you get one of those things wrong, you can't even get to the point of principle because you're not in agreement on the. Would you call
you
that
can't talk about you can't talk about the principles until you've actually laid out your situation. It doesn't make sense. There's an instance of this.
You're talking about the variables involved, essentially.
Yeah. So there's another example of this actually, which I think will better flesh out my point, which is a real thing. So some of the ancient Greek thinkers, one of them thought that if you take what's the slingshot. If you take it, like David and Goliath,
sure. You
got the slingshot and you're spinning it around. You're spinning the rock around with the rope, and then you throw it. After you've thrown the rock, is it going to go in a straight line, or is it going to curve to the left or the right? So obviously, everyone knows it's going to go up and down. Everyone knows that, but is it going to curve to the left or the right, or is it going to go straight? And so these ancient thinkers were thinking it would actually it would go off to the side. And this wasn't because of air resistance. Like they were just sitting down and thinking about this.
Interesting.
This is not about the spin of the ball. Like if there was no air resistance, right? If there was no air and frictionless ball or whatever,
they still thought it would
veer off to the side. Yeah, because they were just sitting down and thinking about it. So even if they agree on a vocabulary, it's like the underlying principles, aren't there. And it was interesting because now when you just talk about Newton's laws of motion, it's obvious that it's just going to go in a straight line
because the principles agreed on.
Yeah. Agreed. And what I think happens in politics is we lay out a situation with a certain vocabulary, and people kind of buy into the vocabulary, but the way people spin the narrative is in terms of principles that aren't shared. I think that's when you look at abortion. not to go down whether or not,
sure,
just to talk about how people talk about it.
Sure.
Right. It's the pro-life people say we're pro-life, and you're pro-choice or pro-abortion, and the people who are pro-choice say I'm pro-choice and you're anti-choice. And it's just a totally different frame.
But I wonder how much sometimes even the disagreement on the principle can then impact vocabulary. I mean, you see that so much in the abortion debate. You hear people talk about being, pro-life, anti-life. You'll hear like pro-life people talk that way. These anti-life, murdering. Whereas the other side of it is talking about, choice, reproductive freedom. They're taking it from a completely different set of principles, and their vocabulary is thus altered by the conviction of the principle. So, I mean, those things seem to be fairly reciprocal at some level. I don't know what that means necessarily in terms of our conversation. But.
So, like, if we could put this into a word or phrase, like, what are people doing? It's political language. Maybe that's the right way to. Maybe that's the phrase.
Let's take it back a moment, because in those two ways of, I think this is actually very illustrative of that point, which is, in the political sphere, or when you're trying to influence culture through like activism, most of what you're doing is you're speaking. You're just kind of what you started with. I don't know if that was in the first part of the second start, but the slogan, the elevator pitch, the bite-sized piece that assumes a certain amount of shared principles and shared vocabulary, and yet we've just kind of talked around the whole notion on the sides of the abortion debate. One side screaming about how you're ripping apart a human being, when the other side isn't even looking at the controversy of whether this is a human life or not, but is looking at the absolute prioritization of a woman's ability to not be pregnant whenever she feels she ought not to be pregnant.
I think I see where I was going with the whole physics discussion. Maybe to break away from the physics language, there's the facts, and then there's people's narrative about the facts. Like, people tell, there's the basic situation, and then there's people's take or story or interpretation of the situation. Okay. And that's kind of what I was getting at in the beginning, was when discussions go bad, like, especially if there's something going on in the family, or it is when relationships go bad in that sense. What I've seen is people, there's a situation, and then people spin their narrative around their own feelings about it, and then that becomes the principles of the matter. So, like, I don't want to give examples because I don't want to talk about people.
Sure.
But I think the exercise. So, how do you counter this? I think the exercise has to be: could I arrive at the same conclusions by entering into this other person's narrative of things, and then could I walk in and walk back out? Like, can I, if I'm just totally in their way of thinking, is there a way to break out of that and get back to where I started, or are they right? Like, does their narrative actually match up better with reality than my narrative?
This is in the academic realm anyway. This is what we would call intellectual honesty, or intellectual integrity, right? Which is to say, if I'm aware, and this requires a certain amount of self-awareness. I think people can be, this is something that has to be fostered, right? Is this sort of internal questioning or internal dialogue to understand more as to my motivation for why I'm speaking the way I am, and I think, like, you, even in having this conversation, you're kind of assuming a base level of that, but some don't have it. I mean, that is very much the case. But I think we all have it in varying degrees, whether we're completely absent of it or we're, like, very sensitive to it. And you see that with some, it's kind of hysterical, like professors that are just brutally intellectually honest, what can happen there is they don't really hold on to anything like as solid. So everything's always shifting, or the possibility of seismic shifts in thought can take place. And I don't think that's like an ideal. Like, I don't think that's anything we work toward, which is like to be so open-minded that there is nothing there, right? I mean, our goal, and I think this is where you're going to see the Thomist in me come out, right? We're all in the end looking for truth, and we want something that is. Truth has a dimension of restfulness. So truth can be at an objective level, it can be at a subjective level, it can be in an experiential level. There's all these different, but like, so my emotional state right now is a truth. So
it's
if
a
I'm,
fact.
It's a
data.
And you would think about it as fact. I would think about it as truth. So like, that's a hysterical
data
across the divide here. But yeah, I mean I think we would agree on that. And I think where I would come at what colors my understanding of this notion is the whole idea of truth as a transcendental, so something that's above statistical data. Whereas like you would see that your constellation, I think, you tell me if I'm wrong, but your constellation would be that it is really statistically driven. Like you could like bank on that. You could take it home. Like you can observe it. You can capture it. You can quantify it. You can record it.
I'm not sure I follow completely. So
Okay.
You're saying that my language of facts is different from your language of truth, in that I would tend to think about the empirical truths of different situations.
Sure.
Where are you saying?
Yeah,
you might
actually,
be more leaning towards transcendental truths behind things.
Yeah, I think you're going to naturally look at the more empirical side of it, whereas I'm going to look at more of like how it relates to these immaterial things, which is a whole topic that we'll, I'm sure, eventually tackle in a conversation. But
well, I think that's kind of related, because I think you have this idea of reality. That's what I mean by a narrative. It's like it's your I shouldn't say interpretation, but it's your frame.
Frame is like the word that you tend to come back to. But I think it's kind of so the word I like is paradigm. So it's the thing that's like these underlying set of thoughts, right? That sort of inform the way that you think about, grasp a situation when you're approaching it. Yeah. And to our conversation, like we all have a slightly different frame paradigm that we approach a conversation with. So that's why effective communication requires us to almost like grab onto the frame and sort of artificially shift it for a moment. And if we aren't willing to do that, I think we get frustrated really quickly because the other person isn't articulating exactly the same thing that we want them to. Like the end goal of a conversation, a lot of times, I think, at least I'll speak for myself, a lot of times is to hear someone be able to regurgitate back the same sentiment, if not in my words, then in some way that is recognizable to me. But a lot of times the way we deal with conversation is we're going to take an insight based on where, like within our frame, within our paradigm, that sort of resonates to what we know to be true from that paradigm. So when you're talking, like I'm reflecting on like how empirical truths form like a subset of something larger. Now, you're not coming from that perspective, I don't think. But like we do agree that like facts, truth, have this sort of like overlay where we don't have any problem agreeing on, right? It's very easy. Like we're like, even if that's not 100% match, like 1-to-1, we know that we're talking about something that has a lot of overlay. So we can speak freely about that and kind of rest assured that we're mostly like talking about the same thing, but that there is an occasion where that like 10% sliver on each side could be a really interesting point of further conversation because it's the place where we may not actually sync up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that'd be really interesting to explore. I think I want to make a meta observation here about. So I love it. I think there's two kind of strands of thought that are different conversations that are whatever the next 40 minutes are going to be. It could go one of two ways based on how we started here. One is the actual conversations themselves and the ideas around conversations, and that's really interesting. And the other being, I lost it. I'm sorry. Yeah, the other.
So I guess we're taking path one, huh?
No, shoot. You were talking about. You talked about so many things there.
Yeah, I know.
And that was kind of. I want to try and have a sense of like closure on
that piece of things.
Well, I think there were two pieces of things, and I
clearly you can always re-listen to this afterward and then come back to it. But I think so. I don't know where you want to take us next, but I think it's like if we wrap this up, my point is to say that there are like in every conversation we're coming from a paradigm. The other person is coming from another paradigm. And maybe this will actually transition us into the place that you kind of I think wanted to go. That paradigm that we're bringing into a conversation is very formed by our experiences. So those are both like on an emotional level and on an intellectual formation basis.
Epistemology, that's what the second thing was. So we could either talk about conversations or talk about epistemology, because what you were also saying was that you made a comment about how professors who are hyper abstract or intellectual,
sure.
If someone brings up a new idea, they could have a total frame shift and their whole underlying thought structure might just change. And then your point is that's not practical for people.
And I think that is the exception to the rule. Like out just out in ways like that. That's not something more common is to see someone that's very entrenched in their paradigm. It is inflexible. It's very unusual to find someone that has fostered such an openness that they can't they haven't put their foot down on anything solid. So
yeah.
But I think for the purposes of our conversation, we should go forward with conversation because I think there's a lot of fruit.
We should. I was really
low-hanging fruit.
Okay, I was really tempted by something you did say, which was maybe the 10% difference sliver between us and how I might conceptualize truth, because that's what I mean by the whole philosophical epistemological discussion we could have.
That's a fun one, but
yeah. So as far as putting yourself in other, I think now that we've kind of developed a vocabulary, I think that's the closure on our introductory comments, which is now if we have a vocabulary of people have different frames and people think about things in different ways.
Yes.
In any given encounter where you're disagreeing with somebody, how do we navigate that? And I don't have a single unified answer, which bothers my physics side. But I think there's different kind of rules of thumb and maybe observations you could make about how people handle conversations. And I think we touched on this, when people are just inward thinking and they're just thinking about their own feelings, that tends to lead to bad conversations. If you just have your own narrative about the facts and you're not thinking about how someone else, what their story is, why are they doing what they're doing. And if you're not thinking about any of that and you're just focusing on your feelings, you could just lash out at them. Because
so I'm curious, because you've brought this up a couple times now. I mean, I don't want it to get personal, but is there a story or something conceptual, like a story you could tell that is illustrative of your point? Because there seems to be something that you're reflecting on more specifically, like more concrete.
Yeah. There's a couple examples. One is more personal, that has to do with just observations about more family matters.
Sure.
About how discussions were handled.
Sure.
And there's also political discussions, and I think it'd be interesting to talk about that maybe.
Sure.
Where, I think the abortion debate is one example, and this is just people giving out a meme which is meant to be a shutdown. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm gonna make a statement, and the statement implies I'm right. It implies my narrative. Right. It implies my frame, and you have to. It's an attempt to just force people into your frame, into your paradigm. Like one example was Donald Trump. He did something. I think what was it? I think it was the thing he was they were doing the impeachment hearings or about. It was I'm drawing a blank. I think it was has to do. Joe Biden's son. Yeah, some foreign affairs and he was saying you got to investigate, and they're Democrats try to move to start impeachment investigations or whatever. And someone said something on Facebook, like anyone who's trying to defend Trump in this is a traitor. And it's like, not only that, so that's just an extreme. That's an extreme statement. First of all,
absolutely.
This person also said, like, anyone who voted for Trump is not functionally intelligent. Like, this is a phrase I heard from an intelligent person. Like, and it's like it takes the discussion away from whether or not Trump's a good candidate, and it shifts the discussion onto whether or not I'm intelligent. So, and it's
So I think like I'm not. So I'll be transparent and say, like, our discussion of vocabulary and principle, don't quite understand how it fits in yet. But I will say this is, like, those statements, they are out and out principles. Like, those are things that someone flings out there and they immediately shut down conversation because they're not something that's agreed upon at the start of it. So they're hoisting a flag of allegiance, and there is, like, at that point it's war. It's not. There is no dialogue. So maybe, like, one way to look at this is, like, conversation requires a sort of neutral ground. It requires a place where people can come, where there's a safety, I suppose, to share ideas, and that means that. I think coming back really around to some of the original stuff you were talking about, like that shared sort of human practice, if you will, of being able to sit down across from someone who you disagree with, at least at some level, sometimes maybe radically, but be able to engage in an exchange of ideas that doesn't result in, as soon as someone says something that doesn't fit in your paradigm or your frame, you're gonna get up and, like, shoot them in the head. Like, there's a but I mean, that's kind of an extreme characterization. But I think at some level, the requirement for dialogue is at least some degree of curiosity. To bring it back to that point, if I don't have any curiosity about what you bring to this conversation, there is no conversation. Yeah, we can talk at each other, but at that point, you might as well not be engaging in conversation because there's nothing happening.
Yeah. Well, I think this is kind of good to have as the edge case. This is the worst possible conversation. Most conversations aren't like this.
Sure, absolutely, totally agree with that.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I would actually say that there's facts. Like, there's the situation that happened where Donald Trump, said something to, the president of another country, and he's, there's an impeachment hearing about it. Like, those are the facts. And what are the principles we're bringing to bear? What a principle might be, we shouldn't ask foreign leaders to investigate our political opponents. That might be a principle, right? It's a general statement which is generally true. Whereas we apply to the situation, the facts of the situation, if that makes sense. So that's where my understanding of facts and principles or vocabulary, description of our situation, and then the principles, that's how they interact for me.
So is the principle in this case the fact that Trump, or the principle would be not specific to Trump, but on a higher level, that the President of the United States should not be engaged in personal interests overseas, what's the exact phraseology that they're using?
You
shouldn't be engaged in.
There could be different principles at work here. One, he shouldn't, be engaged in corruption where he's using his power for his own self-interest. And then there's an anti-corruption principle. And then there's another principle of you shouldn't have your political opponents just investigated because you have the power to investigate arbitrarily. And those are different principles. And there might be a hierarchy of principles.
Sure,
one of them might be
more
subsumed
important
under the other.
So I think this is where it gets difficult, though, because would you say that those principles are agreed upon, or they're shared?
I think the problem for dialogue is that the person who's on the receiving end of that statement won't be able to unpack it in real time.
Go on.
Because if you say, hey, if you vote for Trump, you're a traitor. It's like, first of all, no, I'm not. But how do I how?
So there's a million steps between the principle and that conclusion.
Right.
But we're skipping over all those steps, and we're making that conclusion, and we're assuming that the distance from here to here is self-evident. That's what's happening for that person. That is what we would call I would call intellectually dishonest. For someone, if someone really wants to enter into a dialogue, they're not doing that. They're curious about the process by which, someone might arrive at a different conclusion with the same principle. So I think to answer the question that I posed, let me see if you agree. I would say that those principles have to at least be tacitly shared. Like, I suspect that you agree with me when I say that the president should not be engaging in this kind of behavior. Like, you may try to cover it up, you may try to detract from it, you may try to give reasons why in this case that might not be as important as other principles, but that we generally agree on that principle. Would you agree
I think
with that?
What I would say is going on is there's a dishonest formulation of the principles which isn't being formulated, but it's being implied.
And I'm going to take you one step further. I would say it's a prioritization of those principles. Just like you articulated that there's multiple principles going on. So, I listened for a long time to Ben Shapiro, who I kind of enjoy, mostly because, I don't know, he's a religious Jew, which is the funniest combo. But he's definitely and I kind of again, the sort of intellectual honesty that he brings. He's I am a conservative talk show host. I'm not an objective reporter of these things.
Yeah.
And he's gonna come at that angle, and I appreciate that sort of transparency and that self-awareness to be able to say that. When he's engaging ideas, sometimes he's dismissive, like every other, any other political commentator out there. They're very dismissive of the other side. But sometimes I think it's a hint of this sort of curiosity. A lot of times it I think day after day engaging it ends up requiring you to become kind of bitter, and it ends up with a certain exasperation. But to enter into a dialogue, and I think on an individual basis, he's proven to do this fairly well. His Sunday specials, where he invites people on that may disagree with him, and he has a civil conversation and just allows them to talk. The trademark of him doing that is that he shuts up. He shuts up and he listens kind of attentively. And I don't know how much prep he does going into these things, but I know, probably does background checks on people and whatnot, and tries to understand facts about them, and maybe they're, I would say, hot button issues, with the things that they care about.
Yeah.
But then in real time, he's formulating reactions to what they are speaking of. I mean, these aren't questions. He's not just okay, and now this prepared question.
He's responding to what they're actually saying.
He's responding to what they're saying.
Yeah.
But the thing that I find interesting and is relevant to this point of the conversation is this sort of questioning, and if he can't understand it by way of them speaking to him directly or speaking to the mic or whatever it is, he'll ask them directly for a clarification on whether they agree on something or disagree on it. That's an essential piece of conversation, to be able to ask questions. So I think you could do an examination of conscience on communication, if you will. We can take a little Catholic spin on this, right? It's like, have I shut up? Have I allowed someone to speak freely?
Yeah.
Without me cornering them into a sort of a place that they have to respond to me. But am I allowing them to kind of, their thought to be free enough that I can get a sense of where they're coming from beyond the mere response to my question? If I know that, I can establish whether or not we agree on that principle. And if I'm not sure, I have the liberty to ask. With, again, safe space, I'm able to ask them if we actually agree on this principle. And if we do, and they hesitate, so say in this case, like, do we agree that Trump, like the President of the United States, should not be engaged in self-interested actions overseas? And they might respond, and they might get a little dodgy about the question. Then the curiosity should turn to that. Like, what is it? Like, what is it that's going on there?
Is it a leading question?
What's a leading question?
Well, that's the question. So when I ask a question, every time I ask someone a question, I'm also examining whether or not it's a leading question. Which was, it was interesting because when I had my podcast with, the whole bunch of, science people, I started off with a question, which was, do we put science underneath the umbrella of our faith, or do we hold them in parallel, where they're separate, non-overlapping magisteria, kind of separate but equal? And right away, people were breaking the paradigm. Like, the question has an implied paradigm.
Right.
Is science a subset of our faith, a subset of everything we believe, or is we hold it kind of in parallel, equal, separate but equal, non-overlapping? And right away, people were kind of giving examples where they're both. It's just, you break the paradigm of the question.
Right.
And so that's what I try to do, is first of all, is ask questions that get to what people actually believe in their own words. And I try to avoid questions with an implied paradigm, if I can.
Is that possible?
Usually not, but what you try to do in the dialogue is to, if they are dodgy about the question, or maybe there is a paradigm that they're not in. Maybe the question has an implied paradigm that the other person just isn't, it's not in that paradigm, and maybe they don't know how to get out of that, because this is a deep abstract thing. Like, the paradigm behind your question is not articulated. Okay. So in real time, the person might not be able to process all that. They just kind of react by not knowing really how to answer the question.
Okay, perfect example of this, and this is like a tiny bit personal, but I mean, might as well go there. When I was in college, so I came from I don't even know how to describe like my Catholic upbringing. My parents were both like really, I'd say like very devoted Catholics. So my dad like loves his faith, but it's very formal in his approach to it. My mother had kind of had a cultural Catholicism all her life. Never really had a spiritual dimension to it until she met my father, and his formal adherence to the faith and his steadfastness in that sort of elevated her spiritual engagement with the faith. And I was raised in a household where my mother and my father were like absolutely one in their approach to the faith, but it was still of a formal character. I grew up in that. I loved the faith. I loved like all the trappings of it. I loved Mass. I was the kid that played Mass in his basement or whatever. Wow. I went, absolutely, dude. And I was a little bit of a nerd, and the faith was an identity that I took with me. When I got to college, I went to Franciscan University, and at Franciscan University, I was posed with a question often that I didn't know how to respond to, which was, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ? And I said, I don't know. One, the language was not the same. I had never heard that construction of a phrase before. It seemed foreign to me. It sounded Protestant. I didn't know what that meant. Like, I didn't know how to think categorically I didn't even understand what they were asking. So my first response to that question was no.
Yeah.
And that got me into a lot of hot water because people were like, "Oh, you have to attend this seminar and this thing," right? And it was crazy. But eventually, like, I wisened up because I was like, everything that people are saying is like really strange and odd because, like, I'm not irreligious. Like, I'm not non-Christian. Mm-hmm. So what does this mean? And I began to understand that paradigm a little better to the point where I could dialogue with it. And I think that's an example of, like, now I could say, like, at the time they asked me that question, absolutely had a relationship with Christ, but I didn't understand it in those terms.
Yeah.
I also had the kind of relationship with Christ that comes from the practice of religion where it's pretty much just the practice of religion. Yeah. I didn't have a deep prayer life. I had some of it. I knew how to talk to Christ in my own words. But I think all of this is just to say, without going too far afield into the personal milieu here, is that's a really good example, I think, of a paradigm being so distinct and different around topics that are similar that there can't be dialogue until there's real effort put into understanding where someone else is coming from. The question sort of that was posed to me was so absolutist. It was a yes and no answer. And I didn't have the material, didn't have the experience, the conceptual frame to be able to answer the question.
Paradigm.
And it put the dialogue into. So if I answered yes, I was being I was being intellectually dishonest. If I said no, then I was not actually answering truthfully.
And on their end, their question doesn't give them insight into what what's in your head.
Not at all.
And so that's almost on them, where it's like I need to ask you questions,
absolutely,
which are going to actually get me to learn what's going on in your head. Like, I need to ask questions that are going to get me to learn about you, And if I'm asking questions in a way that's, and this is more of how you come off in a conversation. But if you ask people questions in a way that is absolutist like that, where it's like, here's a yes or no question. Here's the paradigm, which you have to assimilate. You have to assimilate to my paradigm of things. Right. And if you ask things in that way too strongly, you're not going to actually learn about other people.
No,
that's very political. And there again, another two branches that I'm seeing for the conversation. One is the doomsday scenarios, which is there's political and relationship conversations, like if a family is having bad relationships, or political conversations that are just really, really bad, toxic. There's I think we started by talking about the worst case scenarios there, and it's like what are they missing? And that kind of took us into the basics of conversation again, sure. Which is people's frames and trying to break through into trying to realize that there's two different paradigms at play here in this conversation. Absolutely. And I want to try to understand yours, and I want to help you understand mine. But that's a good conversation, And so there's the two conversations we're having was the doomsday conversations, and then there's good conversations about the natural struggles in good conversations. Yeah. And I think I kind of want to go there because
absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree. That's more it's more fruitful.
It's more pertinent too. I think most conversations are of that sort.
Absolutely.
Most conversations you're going to have are just people who are living in different paradigms and, maybe just want to kind of break through. Something you said jogged my mind. A lot of times you did ultimately learn how to talk to these people.
Yeah.
And learn how to
talk
to you.
Years.
Yeah.
Took years.
I think what you said something interesting too. In retrospect, if you knew what you did now, you would have just answered the question yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is
because I understood what they're referencing by using that vocabulary.
Right.
Again, I think it's like it comes back to that point, which is I literally just didn't have a vocabulary. I did not know what they were speaking about.
Yeah. Well, the kind of meme in my head, as far I really kind of want to there's a use for sound bites. Well, there is a use for sound bites, which is I think if we're having an abstract kind of winding conversation, I think having sound bites of what we're talking about is kind of useful. And I think one phrase that came into my mind is that familiar concepts could be hiding behind unfamiliar words.
Oh, absolutely.
Or,
I think this is the most thrilling part of a conversation, but go ahead.
Yeah. Another way of framing it is palatable concepts could be hiding behind unpalatable words. To put it a different way. And I think I talked about this with you before, but there was a great conversation I had with a friend of mine who is not Catholic at all, is non-religious, but is kind of vaguely spiritual, kind of impressed by Buddhism. And we were talking about God. And because we both believe in something divine, and she has a more vague, I shouldn't say vague, well, because what she said to me was, we were talking about God. She says, I believe that I am God. And I believe that you are God. And my dog is God.
I remember this conversation.
And as a Catholic, all the red flags are going
right
up in my head. That is
alarms.
That is not the correct phrase.
Sirens off the shore.
Yeah. And that's such a non-Catholic thing to hear. Whereas there are words that she's noises are coming out of her mouth, and it's raising red flags in my head. And so I kind of put that on pause, and I said, all right, what's she getting at? She's having, so what I decided to realize was, look, she has an intuition or experiences, and for some reason these words, that phrase, captures her intuitions. So I'm going to try and see what the intuitions are, because I can't deal with the phrase. I cannot deal with that phrase. I can't perform operations on it to turn it around. We can't live in the space of that phrase where, I am God and you are God. It's the only thing I could say to that is no, from my paradigm.
Right.
So what I did was I said, I have to figure out what's the basic intuition behind that, because if we could talk to that, then maybe we could have a breakthrough. And that's exactly what happened. And her basic, not to get bogged in the details, but her basic intuition was that she believes that, the divine is this sort of reality itself.
Right.
And I was thinking, that's straight out of Aquinas.
This is exactly what I was going to say, because I remember hearing the story, and it was kind of funny, because the real-time reaction is exactly the way you describe. It's this momentary freak out. And I think this is the place where how you're, whether you're going to have a conversation or whether you're going to take up activism, this is the point, right? There's a departure point. But you have to have Aquinas talks about being as the foundational principle of all things, right? So immaterial or material, and God is being.
Yeah,
we participate in being by being created. We have contingent being, so it means that we're reliant. We're not just here because we are here because of someone else. We don't just exist here because we exist. God is the only one like that. But in as much as we exist, and this is it's kind of a mind-bending philosophical concept, we participate in God in that way.
Yeah.
And it's not to say anything about weird, if you're going to get into Catholic dogma, that doesn't mean we're divine. It doesn't mean that we are, just because a rock, it has being, doesn't mean that it is immaterial, right? It is a material created thing, but its existence merits that it has being. So it really is that's a nuanced philosophical concept.
Yeah.
But when someone says something like that, and this is Aquinas' method, where people go wrong with Aquinas, a lot of times, not to go off on this tangent too long, but I think it's worth saying, people look at Thomas and they look at a system, a closed system. But Aquinas' method was such that he took from everywhere. He was the master conversation. He would articulate the arguments of those who disagree with him better than they articulated it for themselves. And they would readily, there were people that agreed with that notion, that he in some ways defended their position better than they were able to do it themselves. They were adequate. They were adequate for them. And I think that's kind of like a micro goal in conversation, is to be able to say, like, I not only understand where you're coming from, but I could stand shoulder to shoulder with you and argue for what you're saying. To do that requires you to shift your frame, to be able to kind of occupy the same frame, or as close to it as possible, without a conversation wouldn't be much of a conversation if there wasn't still a frame of reference that was different.
Well, to kind of condense all that, when I'm having a conversation, I take it upon myself to articulate your position back to you to your satisfaction.
Right. This is a huge technique, especially in academia. But like in everyday conversation, if you listen to any, like I've been in a year-long relationship with a gal. Mm-hmm. It's an amazing opportunity to learn communication, right? Yeah. And one of the things that we've done is read some material or listened to some material on communication. And the first, like the most unifying aspect of all the advice that you're given is that, like, you be able to speak back to the person what they are saying. When you get to that level, and you're not just like shouting past one another the things that they need to hear, or trying to kind of plead with them that they're not, that they're not yet, we're not yet syncing up, but you're able to actually enter into their world, so to speak, their affective, intellectual world, to be able to reach back across and say, this is what I think you're saying. Is that what you're saying? That's a powerful tool in communication.
Yeah. Actually, this is kind of jogging something else for me too, where I see a lot of academics do this, where they're asked a question and then they give a roundabout answer. And I think what's going on there is when someone asks them a question and it's like it's so obvious that they're in a different paradigm. What the response is I'm just going to articulate to you my paradigm, because I don't want to get bogged down in the words of this question. Right? This question and the way it's phrased means we have different paradigms. So I'm just going to articulate my own paradigm. And something else too is, in order to do that, like I'm not going, if I'm going to articulate my narrative to you of how I actually see things, I have to give the reasons why I believe something. Not reasons which I think you will accept, but reasons why I actually believe something. So if I have an opinion about abortion or Donald Trump or any issue, or an opinion about something that happened between us, family thing, relationship thing, I parked in a funny way and that pissed you off, I don't know. but it's because there was a snowbank that was in the way, and I took up 2 spots instead of 1, and someone was salty about me over that.
No relation to real life events, though.
That was hypothetical.
Hypothetical.
Yeah, winter's coming. I'm just just getting ready. It's almost. I've gotten a lot more mileage out of conversations with people when I actually give them the reasons why I believe in something, rather than giving them a reason which I think they will have to accept logically. For the paradigm in my head, the idea in my head, I shouldn't say paradigm, but like in apologetics, like I remember in high school really kind of getting into what are apologetics people say, like what are apologists saying, and they're talking about history and the historicity of the resurrection, quote quote,
sure.
And they're talking about 5 arguments for the existence of God, quote quote. Great, that's interesting philosophy. It's an interesting historical exercise, but the fraction of Catholics who are Catholic, like why do most Catholics believe what they do? It's not because of Aquinas and history. Like, I think Aquinas and history come after their beliefs. There might be a few people, like, don't get me wrong, who thought their way into the church because of these arguments and historical facts, but most Catholics, I'd put it as like 99.95. Like, most Catholics believe it because of their experiences and their upbringing. And
I'm trying to understand. So I've heard you talk along these lines, both in like the podcast preceding this one, and also just in conversation with you before. I'm just not sure I actually agree. I have a lot of friends
Well, could I ask the
sure.
follow up with one more? So so I'm going to say a phrase, and there's a paradigm behind it, and I think you're going to react by
Folks,
trying to
this
break
is
out
real
of
time
that.
right now. This is happening.
Yeah. We're having the conversation and we've got a conversation in parallel. So
literally, everyone is what they're doing right now is picking us apart as we're dialoguing. Are they even following their own principles? Yeah.
All right. So the question for me is, if most Catholics believe based on their own religious experiences and their upbringing, why, if we're in dialogue with someone who fell away from the faith, or if we're in dialogue with an agnostic atheist, why would we give them Aquinas in history when that's not actually the reason that most people believe in it?
Because we're not dealing with a statistical probability. We're dealing with a person. Each individual comes at the faith with a different set of experiences, like background. So, like, for instance, apologetics exists because of a large swath of questions that people have from especially a Protestant background. That's really what apologetics is. It's not a system that's been built just to like deal with thought experiments. They're dealing with real questions that people generally have coming out of a certain background. And in America, that's always going to be, or it's not always, but again, a large quantity of those are people that are coming from a place of evangelical Christianity. Questions about Mary, questions about the Eucharist, questions about the church, questions about clerics and the historical development of the church, and all of these things, right? Sort of things that are sort of systematically taught in evangelical Christian circles. So there's a context for why that apologetic system sort of exists. Mm-hmm. Someone who already has faith in Christ more naturally appreciates apologetics, which is, I think, where I wanted to part with you, because I think this could get too cookie cutter. I agree with that statement. Exactly. I think we agree on this. But I think it's worth saying. So someone who has no faith in Christ or doesn't understand, like, someone who comes from an Italian family who grew up, like, really Catholic in their practice, has big parties every time there's a First Communion or First Confession or whatever, and then like goes and just lives whatever life they want afterward.
Okay.
They're not really. They haven't found Christ. They have no reason for their faith other than it's something that my family does. That person is going to be evangelized very differently than someone who is coming from a background where they're very committed to worship every Sunday. They sort of like understand that on a more innate level, like the importance of God in my life. So everyone that comes into this situation, I would say the one thing I can appreciate in where you're coming from is that an experience of God underlies sort of the purpose of even having that conversation, rather than this is what intellectually makes sense. This is the structure that I can build, and then like it all makes sense. I think I do agree with you that on a sort of basic level, the experience of God in one way or another, and I think that can be more intellectual or emotional. I don't know that it's exclusively emotional. Yeah, that underlies it. So I know there's a lot there.
Yeah. I'm going to respond. I need to take a leak real quick.
Okay. Cue the elevator music.
All right. We're back. So let me see if I can what I think you're saying, and tell me if you're right.
These meta conversations make for really embarrassing moments if we do it wrong.
I like it.
Dude, I love it.
My original statement was maybe we should give the reasons we actually believe things rather than philosophical frameworks which would constitute reasonable reasons to believe things. Mm-hmm. And I think your reaction to that was people, maybe this is too simple. People almost deserve to hear good reasons why you should believe what I believe.
Wait, say that one more time, just so I catch it.
They're like, people deserve to hear the real reasons why you should believe something. So there's an implication here.
Sorry, who are you speaking to? People.
So if I'm in dialogue with an atheist,
okay.
right? Should I give him my own reasons for why I believe something, or should I give him an apologetics answer, which maybe I should put together a philosophical framework which would make Christianity, actually philosophically sound and historically accurate? Or do I focus on the reasons I actually believe what I do?
And I think before any of that, I think the most important thing is understanding like why the atheist is an atheist. Like, because I think seminally, there's usually a set of experiences like the converse of what we've been talking about is, for someone who doesn't believe in God or isn't, is evangelical but isn't Catholic or is any variant of that story, is agnostic. There's a set of reasons why they are the way they are. I mean, it's not usually, there is such a thing as an unreflected life. And those people are usually pretty willing to just kind of like, keep the peace and move on. They're not really interested in a conversation. But someone who actually holds a belief, whether it's, that there is no God, that there might be a God, I just can't know. I don't really, there's the agnostic that's not interested in knowing. But like all of those flavors, like the most interesting thing that can happen is in actually trying to understand why. First, why? And then when you sort of, and I think this is where it gets interesting, right? Is when you can have that conversation, and something that we haven't mentioned yet is conversations just take time. So this is the other thing, and that usually they're not one unique conversation. Like it is a dialogue that goes on for spans, to really have an effective conversation, like a long-standing one. You have to be able to kind of enter into each other's lives in a way. So I'm going to understand what makes you tick, whether it's your personal interest, your family background, but like that's going to inform your conviction about whether you believe in God or you don't. And when I'm able to, again, kind of enter into more of your frame, the paradigm that you're bringing from your collective experiences, then I think some of that comes more naturally. If someone has a much like a woundedness emotionally in handling the idea of God because they were abused as a kid, or they had all this, they had some kind of experience of some real evil that they're grappling with, the age-old problem of evil.
That's going to be a very different.
That's going to be
problem
a very
from
different conversation.
Someone who just doesn't see any evidence. Quote unquote. They're just in a
so
scientific paradigm.
It doesn't matter how well I think through like what I should do as a cookie cutter option, like coming into these conversations. Like I just don't know that the value of understanding a paradigm, and how unique a paradigm is to each individual, is like. I think a real, I'm pulling all these philosophical terms, but a hermeneutical key. Do you know what I mean when I say that? It's like a way.
I looked it up once. Yeah,
it's like a way.
What's hermeneutics?
Hermeneutics is like, you could say the application of a paradigm. It's
so if you have a set of principles, it's applying them to situations.
Yeah. Yeah, so like if you say like that's a concept that if you were to apply, like whenever you interact with a human person, the first question you were to ask is
it reverse epistemology?
I don't know, dude. I gotta be perfectly honest too. There's a very we're buttressing up against the area of expertise or the edges of expertise. Like I'll just start to say things I don't understand. But
okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think that becomes like a really, I don't know.
So let me say here's where I'm coming from too, is in actual conversations with people, the way we open up to religious topics. So if I'm talking with an atheist or agnostic or fallen away Catholic or something, the way the conversation about religion always comes up is they'll say something, they'll make a profession of faith, which is, I believe in science over religion, or I think people should just do what makes them happy, or they'll make some profession of faith which is contradicting what we believe, and it's a deliberate thing that they say. It's just, if we start broaching the topic of religion, they'll kind of make their position, they'll plant their flag in the sand.
Yeah.
And that's when we have to make a decision to start getting into history and philosophy, or take the conversation down an experience rabbit hole. That, you know what I'm saying? So that's kind of where I'm coming from, is in actual conversations, they actually force these moments.
You're kind of talking about the starting point of a conversation at this point.
Yeah, but the reason I am is because they force moments where we have to make a decision.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree with that.
And when someone comes out,
I've kind of been talking about a conversation like
as it plays out,
as it's happening. But you're absolutely right. The onset of a conversation sort of dictates the circumstances by which you are what you're going to talk about on the initial onset. And I'm sure, are you kind of like in your mind right now? Are you visualizing this at work or like after hours? Like
I'm just visualizing the most recent conversations I had. So the most recent one I had was with Claudia's boyfriend.
Okay.
And the one he said was, people just got to do what makes them happy.
Okay.
And the way I like, and so what I did was I kind of take the phrase that they give me, and I kind of pick it apart a little bit, and that kind of opens them up to their actual experience. And so my reaction was, well, but the goal was to talk about experiences and to share mine. Like, for me, that's actually the goal of the conversation. My goal is not to talk about philosophy and history.
Sure. My
goal is to talk, if that happens, great, but my goal is actually to get them to a point where they're receptive to my experiences and my take on things. Like, that's my goal, is to get them to a point where they can receive my paradigm in my own words.
Sure.
And so what I did when he said, I think people should be happy, the first thing I did was pick apart the statement, and then the second thing is get him to talk about his experiences, and the third thing, once he's talking about himself, is I could talk about my experiences.
So walk us through that. Like, what did you do when you picked apart the statement? Well,
I said that I just happen to know this fact. There was a study that was done about happiness versus satisfaction, and so they sampled people, they texted the people in this, the people who were conducting the study texted their subjects 3 times a day, kind of at random points, and they were asking them, are you happy right now? And then another question was, are you satisfied with the way your life is going? And so these are actually mutually exclusive questions, which is really interesting.
Really?
Yeah, where people who are spending more time with significant others and more time with their family and friends report higher levels of happiness at any instant in time, but lower satisfaction when they reflect on how my life is going. And then people who are developing themselves, pushing themselves, making more money, like having traditional success in that regard, they report lower happiness at any given moment, but when they reflect, they're thinking, I'm killing it. I'm higher satisfaction. These are mutually exclusive. And so when he said happiness, I'm like, I kind of responded with that observation. And he says, well, you still just got to do what makes you happy. Like, he's kind of stuck on this phrase where happiness meant the balance of happiness and satisfaction, because you want to balance these things. And he's like, so you're balanced. And I'm like, and my reaction to that was like, so happiness is such a flexible term for you. It doesn't mean anything. Like, do you realize that? And so then, and I kind of pushed him a little bit on that, and we kind of it was an intellectual kind of talk, but then it turned into, well, how do you actually spend your time? Because you think people should spend their life as it makes them happy, and people should have the freedom to do that. And I'm on board with you in that regard. But like, how do you find happiness? Because he actually said that if someone just likes eating and in excess, and just being a slob and watching TV and being overweight, like some fatty, like, I think that was kind of his word. It wasn't. Yeah. He said if they're actually happy doing that, fine. And I said, okay, fine, but you don't hold yourself to that standard, right? Because he was athletic, you know, he has a career, you know, he has a relationship, you know, it's like he's holding himself to a higher standard, it seems to me. Like he actually has some order to his life, and there's something going on there, and I pointed that out. And he was like, yeah, and he, you know, he kind of acknowledged that, and he was still kind of stuck on this phrase, I'm doing what makes me happy. But I think we're kind of past the point of being stuck on a phrase here, because now we're talking about actually how is he spending his time in his life, and because the context was I was talking about podcasts about religion, and I'm Catholic.
Sure.
And so he said, you know, to me, well, you know, following the rules of the Catholic Church didn't make me happy, so now here's how I'm living my life. And he was receptive to my response to that, which was, look, I've had, you know, a religious experience, and it was through the Catholic Church that I've had it. And not only that, but when I orient my life in a way that responds to that experience, good things actually happen, and that's how the rubber hits the road. And it's a kind of a comprehensive list of like just laying it out there. And
no, I think so. Like, I think you're demonstrating, and this is why I wanted to kind of get into the weeds on it a little bit, because you're demonstrating the intersection, the overlap, like this sort of understanding. Like you have a nuanced position that you want to introduce that works as a way of pivoting the conversation such that you can kind of grapple with some ideas that are bigger, that with that initial onset, like he's not really saying a whole lot, you know, like, or you don't know what he's saying more accurately, right? I mean, it's like whatever makes you happy, I think that's what you should do. It's not a very, like, from your paradigm, it's not an incredibly nuanced statement. For him, it may be very significant. It may have a lot of thought underneath, but by entering in through the mutual term, right, happiness, and having a broader conversation of what happiness is, which I think is something I'd probably do something similar. I'd probably come at it like, if I was coming to a conversation like this, I'd probably say like, yeah, I think I think that's really what we're after, is to be happy. You have a neat angle with the satisfaction and happiness and the study. That's like a really great topic to introduce, because you're kind of like opening like a space,
the dialogue
where he can react to it in real time, and you can provide some thoughts that you've had on it already, and you get that conversation going. I think the important thing is to kind of challenge. I think a lot of conversation can shut down when everything is so, and I don't think in reality we are as relative as we kind of proclaim ourselves to be culturally. Like, yeah, you do you. Like, I don't care. Like, why don't I care what you do? Like, if it makes you happy, whatever. Like, that's a very pervasive mentality in the larger culture. So it comes up in conversation a lot when we dialogue with people. But I think and I think you kind of really started this in the presentation of, yeah, but there's like, you know, there are things that you hold yourself to that are kind of like collective, that we all, like values that that are supposedly something that we should all share, or at least you're kind of inherently kind of alluding to that. So yeah, it's difficult, because I think coming from a place, the Catholic paradigm is a challenge to the culture. This is a great, if we ever did another podcast, this would be a kind of a neat one. We come from a paradigm, the Church's paradigm is natural law based. Yeah. That things have inherent meaning, things have purpose inherent in them. Like the whole idea of sexuality having a purpose, the idea of us having an end, a supernatural end, that this table has the end of being a table, which is to be eaten upon, not just used like whatever, it's just whatever you want it to be. Like their purpose is imbued in everything in the Catholic life. So the biggest obstacle, I think, or the biggest paradigm, and I'll admit readily, I don't exactly report to know how to do this, but I think this is the biggest challenge for having a conversation with a non-Catholic and a Catholic, or a Catholic, between a Catholic and someone who is deeply entrenched in this, is how to have a conversation where you're coming from a place where there is purpose that exists on an objective level, and then you're dialoguing with someone who only really believes in meaning as it's created subjectively. I think that's the great divide, if you will. Like that, a conversation really begins to pick up when you can agree that there is purpose in things.
Yeah, I have two thoughts which kind of went different ways in that. One is when I was able to open up to him about my religious experience, the way I described it to him, it's like it was obvious, like he never heard that before. Because we both grew up
like a personal testimony, or
no, the way I described my religious experiences, he had never heard it that way before.
Interesting.
And the way I described it was, I don't know, maybe this is relevant now, but the way I describe my religious experience is an encounter with God is kind of like an encounter with nature. It's similar in a lot of ways, which is if you go to like Alaska and you see a mountain and an ocean at the same time.
I think you've talked about this. Yeah,
maybe. But if you see like a mountain and an ocean at the same time, it's so big and it's so gorgeous,
so vast.
There's a sense of the infinite, but there's also a sense of perfection at the same time.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of beauty.
Yeah.
And so I actually have religious experiences when encountering persons. And so for me, it's like I could find a place inside myself when I'm like in a dialogue with somebody, or it's actually a religious experience where I'm seeing that, you know, someone that I'm talking to has a whole life behind them and a whole future of worries and hopes ahead of them, and there's just a universe inside their head, and I can get caught up in the vastness of that. Yeah. And in the vastness I see there's a beauty, and maybe there's words that I could say to them where a whole universe goes dark, and maybe there's words I could say to them where a light shines in a dark universe. You know what I mean? Like it's a divine encounter, almost like, you know, an ocean or a mountain. And that's an experience I have. And then belief in God is like encountering the perfect person. And it's like, it's that sense of infinity, but also perfection, and also the sense of, you know, being loved by that person. And an encounter with God is different from a sort of experience of a person, you know, like another monkey like me, but
yeah, I mean,
but there's a sense of experiencing the divine through personhood. And you get a sense of the infinite in the concept of a person.
I see what you're saying. Kind of like uniting, like and this is
beauty and the
very
infinity.
Catholic. This is very Catholic. The transcendent, like the imminently, like the what is like beyond, like the infinite, what is infinitely above us, and what is most intimately like with us. Like that concept of is God, and I think there's like age old, sort of paradox of, is God is most transcendent and he's most immanent. Like he is most with us and he is most above us.
Yeah.
Like so
it's an experience.
That the crossroads of that experience is I think like
it opens you up.
You're speaking directly to that beauty when encountered. We'll have to take a hard turn after this, but yeah. Beauty when it's encountered has this character that it is like you almost want to reverence it because it's so it's like in some ways transcends you. Like you it's bigger than you. Like you become kind of small next to it, but it is intimate with you. Like in some ways you are sharing in that beauty by appreciating it. Like you're drawn into it. So there's a dualistic sort of motion there going on.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's like one of those steps up a really neat staircase.
Yeah.
You could take.
Maybe to close the loop on this, the follow-up question to that is, well, is it just an experience? And my answer is like, well, it's like the encounter with the mountain and the ocean. It's like when you experience that, you want to act in a way that preserves it. Like you want to go home and you want to care about the environment. Like you want to stop pollution, and it's the same way with when I act in a way that preserves this deep sense of personhood. I think the Hawaiian word aloha is actually this, which is it's the recognition of the divine in somebody else. Like when I actually act out on that in a way that respects it and dignifies that, how does that change my life? I reflect on how I treat people now, and when I act on that, it actually brings out good things. And that's where our disagreement was, because one of the disagreements we had with I had with this guy was on sexuality, and like I could speak to my direct religious experience where I have no sense of aloha when I'm like looking at porn. Like
right,
it just there's a whole dimension, the whole universe of personhood is just stripped away. Right, but that informs my opinion on like pornography. And so that was kind of, he'd never heard that before. Yeah. You know what I mean? He has no religious experience, but I was able to say that, and he heard something he never heard before. Yeah. And I don't think religious people articulate that when someone says, just do what makes you happy. Right. How many our conversations get to that point after that? Like if someone says, I believe in science over religion, how many conversations get there?
Well, I think this brings up like probably like a really helpful point to kind of be coming to at the close of a conversation like this, which is, especially since we are coming from a Catholic paradigm or a Catholic, your podcast is such that it sort of presumes that this really, like your example betrays something really important about when a Catholic is dialoguing with others and I'll try and do this such that we can answer the original question that you posed, which was, how is it that or would you agree that, a good conversation is like is like a truly Catholic conversation. Or it has a Catholic character. I think what's really important is to kind of understand and be very convicted of the fact that unless we're coming from a place where we can speak out of our interior life, a place of encounter with God, a place of prayer, anything that we do to advocate for the faith is completely empty and unconvincing. And I think this is kind of to the point that I think you were kind of hovering around, which is an intellectual argument for the faith is a house of cards unless it has the zeal of an individual who has encountered Christ behind it. And that encounter can be any shade. Like it is just like those people who asked me if I had a personal relationship with Christ, and I did, but it was of a certain kind. Yeah. It may not have been the stereotype of what they would consider such, but in my teenage years, I was the godparent to someone who came into the church. I guarantee you, and I know that all the truths of the faith were not what brought them to the door. Like those were things that some of them made a lot of sense to them, some of them they struggled with, but the reality was they encountered someone who, whether they admired my life or whether they had some kind of empathy with it, and they aspired to have this kind of dimension in their life, that was something that is at an appetitive level. So on the level of an evangelical conversation, which I think is somewhere we've kind of been like moving toward that in the conversation, and I think in some ways it's sort of the end goal of all conversation for a good
evangelization Catholic. Is just a Catholic trying to help someone else see our paradigm.
And not only that, but to actively take steps to engage with Christ, whether it's through prayer, eventually through the sacramental life.
Maybe I should have said apologetics. Where apologetics is trying to get someone else into it's more of a mental frame shift.
No, but I think
apologetics serves evangelization.
It does. Evangelization is such a broad thing.
Not to get caught up in
evangelization is such a broad thing. But like, it cannot make progress unless there's a sharing of that dimension.
I want to acknowledge something here, because if you're talking about sharing experiences with people, and if you're actually getting into why do I actually believe something, what was the life story that brought me here to this point, there's such a vulnerability there. Mm-hmm. And it's a multi-dimensional vulnerability. One, you're being vulnerable with another person. Like, you're talking about your experiences and what's going on under the hood. You have to examine yourself in order just to articulate it. I guess why I'm Catholic, I've spent time thinking about that, so I can articulate that kind of stuff in real time to people. So there's an emotional vulnerability there, but there is a philosophical, epistemological vulnerability too. And I know it's kind of funny. I don't know what else to say, but it's what if I'm examining myself, and what if I'm examining where I came from and why I believe what I do? What if I believe all this stuff and it's not for good reasons? Like, there's a possibility, because there's an assumption here. When you're in a dialogue with someone that's genuine, it's like,
bingo,
I might be wrong, you might be wrong. That's a key assumption in the conversation. Yeah. And what if you actually? But you need to acknowledge that. Like, what if the reasons why I believe something aren't good reasons? And that's huge. That's a deep vulnerability.
But that's essential. I mean, I think that,
forget about the belief being wrong. Like, what if the reasons why I believe it are wrong?
But that happens all the time. You see people that live a religious life for years, and then just completely they just completely depart from it. And I think it really comes down to they have to confront that reality, that the reason I believe this is because I literally was just taught this from the time I was
yeah,
I could think for myself, and I just wrote, that's what I do. That's my identity, right? And that break with that can be a liberating thing for people.
Yeah.
I think the point of that just is to say the unexamined sort of reasons why we believe something are an intense place of vulnerability. And to have a good conversation, we have to be willing to say, I may be wrong. I may see this improperly. You may be able to help me, even if I have deep convictions about something and I think I have something to contribute. Those things are still active.
Yeah.
So it's to say and I think this is something I thought of halfway through this conversation to kind of say, is that a conversation really requires me to look at you and say, you are worthwhile to me. I can't look at you and say, I could really care less, but I'll do this as an errand of mercy. You're not having a conversation.
Yeah.
The only way is that your humanity, your perspective, your paradigm can in some way contribute to my own. That's where a conversation begins, is when you can kind of begin with that notion.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying at the beginning. I think that's what I was getting at when I said there's something Catholic about a good communication between people. Whereas you're recognizing the dignity of the other, and you're recognizing some inherent worth in the other.
Absolutely.
And that's a Catholic spiritual thing.
Well, it's the Catholic anthropology, right? That we are all created in the image and likeness of God. That we have a dignity that is that transcends simply the material that we have. It's why an unborn fetus has that same dignity. It's not merely because they have a certain capacity, but that they have this inherent dignity by they're given an immortal soul by God. It's a whole greater conversation there to be had. But I think that paradigm, or that Catholic conviction comes really to bear in conversation, that you can, whenever you approach someone, there's a sort of reverence, not only for them as another individual, but as a child of God, that has something to contribute to my own interior. Yeah.
There's definitely a reverence for the person and a curiosity of their ideas. Maybe that's the right frame to have. And I mean curiosity, like genuinely curious and turning it around and poking it, and not be, you don't have to be gentle with it. But
it's funny because like I'm recalling how recently Father Mike Schmitz just did a podcast or a video on YouTube about curiosity. Yeah, is curiosity a sin? And he was basically talking about the Thomistic framework of curiosity being something like it's not something that you ought to pursue. So it's like, I just want to know this random trivia to kind of puff me up. That's not what we're talking about contextually here. We're talking about like the mystery of another person who you are encountering, and there's always an appropriateness there. There could be, like, you could say, like, and I think we would both agree, there's a level of having these kind of conversations without being weird about them. Like, to be curious about another person doesn't mean that you're suddenly like, what was your childhood like?
Yeah.
How many siblings do you have? I mean, you can ask those sort of basic questions to kind of get an idea, but you're not being like, what traumas are most important in your way of approaching life? Like, you're not asking those questions off the bat. That takes a lot of, and you may not even really ever have a goal of having those kind of questions asked, because there's no.
Yeah, this is kind of jogging my mind of people who do this slightly wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
I say slightly wrong in a sort of tactical way.
Yeah.
As far as where's the conversation, for example, like if someone says they're an atheist or whatever,
right,
and it's like, did something happen to you as a kid?
Yeah, so true.
It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not really.
No, it's not even an exaggeration. Like, some people really do approach it that way.
Yeah,
I think some of it comes with like
that's not
social maturation, but
and that's it's funny because that's in the spirit of trying to be curious about them, but it's not in the spirit of being genuinely curious about where they're. It almost comes off as I want to respond to what you're saying.
In a way, I think it's almost like
correct you.
Yeah.
I want to correct you and fix you.
Exactly. The motivation is more. It's more directly about, okay, what is the method by which I communicate to you what you need to hear, rather than where are you coming from and how do I actually begin a dialogue with you. Yeah.
There's one more concept that I thought about. Maybe we could wrap it up. Which was I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit hole anyway, but I was talking with my family members. It's kind of a personal topic, but what it came to, I don't know. I'll skip it if for now, and if I have to come back to it,
sure,
fine. But what it came to was like, look, I was at a point, especially towards the end of college, where I drifted a lot.
Yeah.
And then I've been coming back around, and for me, some of the reasons I drifted was like, I can't just accept things based on what I hear. I have to explore them.
Yeah.
And sometimes when it comes to the Catholic lifestyle, it's like only living that, and then looking at other people in college who are partying it up and who are more sociable than me and who have that surface level happiness that I don't have, and it's like I'm curious about that.
Yeah,
I'm curious about this more free will and lifestyle, and because it surface level appears happier. But it's like, if this is all I know, how do I know that I'm right in living this way? And so there's this comes to a weird place from a Catholic perspective, which is, in exploring other ideas, like, in order to understand somebody else, it's like, actually, how much do you actually have to walk in their shoes? Like, actually have done what they did?
I don't know. And, I don't know that the answer to that is that you have to literally walk, like, a mile for mile in their shoes. But I do think that there's a place of intersection that we can all like we accumulate experiences that we can fundamentally say relate to one another.
Yeah.
And I think we take that. I mean, like when we do that all the time. Like we assume those things all the time of things that aren't like point for point. Like we assume that like one drug addict understands another drug addict, though they are entirely on different substances.
Yeah.
But they understand one another. In the same way, I think you can look like.
Well, let me paint it in a very sharp line here, which is, for example, when I'm having dialogue with non-religious people or like atheists, agnostics, I tend to have very good conversations with them, but I attribute that in large part to the fact that I like seriously questioned everything I believe in.
Right.
And I was literally at a point one day walking out of confession asking myself, what happens when I die and nothing happens? I wouldn't have gone to confession. Like phrasing that question in my mind in that way.
Absolutely.
And like I was there because I was at a point where it's like I understand like this scientific way of thinking and this idea that, you know, everything is just, you know, science all the way down. Right. Like I get the basic intuition behind that. I get why people would actually genuinely believe that.
And I think it's really,
and I got there. But I also got out of it. And it's like I can break out of that, which means there's a silver lining, which is when I talk to Catholics who never drifted.
Yeah,
this
is true.
The red flags go off for them. Right. It's like you shouldn't, because there's something about, according to Catholic theory, you shouldn't have to do that. But it's so efficient.
I actually don't know if I don't think I agree with you on that point.
Ooh, I know people who do agree with that point. So
okay, so this is what I would say. This is what I would say is that like there's a paradox right through the center of this topic, and it is a different topic, so I don't want to go afield. But I think the one thing I'll say to it, well, maybe a cliffhanger for more conversation later, but is that St. Paul makes a statement where he says, "Where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more." Mm-hmm. And then he has to literally, the next thing he says, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to have to dig it up. But he says, you know, he basically proposes the question, well, if that's the case, shouldn't we just sin?
Right.
Because he takes it seriously that when we sin, more grace is given to us than if we didn't. Mm. And he's like, well, if grace is such a big, like, if we're after that, shouldn't that be the way that we go about this? And he says, by no means. And then he sort of he explains that there's, you know, you don't put yourself in danger in order to acquire more reconciliation. However, it should give a sinner confidence that when he comes back to God, that God is going to use the experience of sin in a redemptive manner. That is a Catholic paradigm. That's not alien to Catholic ideology. That
it's a Catholic paradox.
It is a paradox, though. And it's one that's actually really kind of hard to get your head around, because you're like, well, if that's the case, why don't I just do whatever I want and then God will just be good to me? But the reality is this: when you stray, when you're not living a Catholic lifestyle, you're not growing. So there's a sort of accessibility that someone who is recently been in sin has with those who are still in sin. And the more he climbs the mountain of holiness, you know, lives a more consistent life, is becoming more virtuous, the more sort of inaccessible he becomes to someone that hasn't begun that journey. And that's not a hard thing to visualize. You look at a monk, and a monk cannot relate to the layperson who is going home every night and turning on the TV and is watching 3 hours of pornography. He can't relate to that. Yeah. Like, he can't journey with that guy.
Yeah.
He can pray for him, and his prayers might be very efficacious, but he can't really dialogue with him.
Yeah.
So, like, we wouldn't say the monk is unfortunate for not being able to do that. The monk is closer to God in a lot of ways.
This is at the heart, because I proposed a topic to you about diversity in the church, and though I think the way I framed it, you kind of balked at, but I think you're getting at exactly what I was saying, was there's a healthy diversity. There's such a thing as healthy diversity, or is this different personalities and different abilities and different capacities and different graces given to people who are better equipped for different situations.
Yeah. But this is the beauty, I think, if we're coming back to the topic at hand. Like, when we are given the blessing of a redeemed experience, especially one like you're talking about, where like I may have gone away or I may have disregarded this particular teaching of the church and I found new meaning in it that was personal in a way that it hadn't been before. Before it was maybe legal, it was a requirement, and now I sort of understand the inner logic of it from my own straying and my own understanding at an experiential level. This really isn't good for me. I have
a newfound orientation. Like, there's something solid about my orientation towards the Catholic life that wouldn't have been there.
Absolutely. And that is grace. That's grace.
Yeah. Trying to figure out how we got
how to
here
wrap it up.
How we got here from talking about conversations, but I think it was really interesting. I actually wasn't really planning on the conversation becoming what it was. But I think what the conversation...
Bro,
I think
this is not unusual for us at all.
No. I think what it became was... we really just... It was a huge elaboration on our starting observation.
I think we actually did a pretty good job building on something fundamental.
There's something Catholic about good communication, which is caring about the other. And if that's your posture towards dialogue. Like, I was really hoping to have a conversation that said that in a non-cheesy way.
Were we cheesy?
No. It was good, because when you say I just want to care about what's going on else in someone else's head, like I want to care about the other. It's like I want to respect the other and I want to listen to what they have to say. It's like we don't need another podcast that says that.
No.
So what I was trying to get was, how do these conversations actually play out when they're done well, and make observations, like just go a little deeper.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we did.
I think we did a good job.
Yeah, that'd be cool. I'll have to listen to it and
splice it up.
I'm gonna observe our conversation about conversations.
The trajectory.
The meta conversation.
That's great. That's fun.
Yeah. I think that's a podcast.
All right.